Montana Territory, 1879. The sky was a hard blue, stretched wide over the Bitterroot Valley, and the wind carried the scent of pine and dust when the woman stepped off the stagecoach with nothing but a cloth-wrapped bundle and swollen eyes. Her name was Alethea Darnell, and she had been banished from her father's home in Helena 3 days ago for crying too much. "You're making a spectacle," her mother had hissed, cheeks red with shame as Alethea wept over the tiny graves of her twin boys. "You'll ruin any chance of redemption if you keep carrying on like this. You're not the only woman who's lost something." Her father had not spoken a word. He simply opened the door and pointed. She walked into the dawn with her grief strapped to her back and her husband's name buried alongside their children. Now she stood in a place she had never been, her boots worn thin and dust-stained. The coach driver had not even waited for her to find her footing before pulling away. She did not blame him. No one wanted to linger around a woman like her. A widow. A mother with no children. A heart cracked wide open. She sank down beside a watering trough near the livery and folded her arms over her knees. Her cheeks were raw from wind and salt. She did not even try to stop the tears anymore. They just came, quiet but steady, like a spring that would not run dry. "Ma'am." A deep voice cut through the haze. She looked up slowly. A man stood a few paces away, tall and broad through the shoulders, his hat drawn low, and a rifle slung over his back. His eyes were green, sharp at first glance, but softer when he saw her face. "I do not mean to intrude," he said, shifting on his boots. "But you look like you could use a place to sit that ain't dirt and splinters." She blinked at him. "I am fine here." "You are not," he said simply. She furrowed her brow. "What do you want?" He crouched down then, arms resting on his knees. "Nothing. Just saw you there and—" "Well, you do not have to stop here." She stared. He tipped his head toward the edge of town. "Got a place just past the creek. Not far. Quiet. If you need a meal or a roof for the night, I can offer both. I do not ask anything in return." She studied him. His voice was steady, not coaxing, just truth. She had nothing left to lose, and something in his gaze like he had seen grief before and not turned away from it made her rise to her feet. "All right," she said. They walked in silence for a time. The town melted behind them, replaced by tall grasses and cottonwoods lining the creek. His horse followed calmly, a black gelding with a white blaze. Alethea kept her arms folded, her eyes on the path. "Name is Quinn Stoddard," he said after a while. "You can call me Quinn." "Alethea Darnell," she replied, eyes ahead. He nodded once. "You come from Helena?" She hesitated. "I did." No more questions followed, just the steady rhythm of boots on earth and the soft rush of water nearby. His cabin came into view, a modest place, built strong, smoke curling from the chimney. He opened the door for her. Inside was warm. A fire crackled low in the hearth, and a stew pot simmered on the hook above it. The place smelled like rosemary and wood smoke. There were books stacked near the window, a rifle rack on the wall, and a worn but clean quilt folded on the cot. "You can have the bed," he said. "I will take the chair." "I do not need," he held up a hand. "It is just a cot, Alethea. Not a favor that ties you to anything." She stepped in slowly, her hands still tight around her bundle. Dinner passed quiet. He served her without ceremony and did not speak unless she did. Afterward, she sat near the fire, her hands curled around a chipped mug of coffee, and stared into the flames. He was across the room, reading something by lamplight. "My boys were 3, she said suddenly. He looked up. "Both of them. Nathaniel and Nolan. Fever took them inside 2 days. My husband died last year working a mine outside Anaconda." Quinn set the book down. "My parents said I had to move on. That crying wouldn't bring them back, and I was making everyone uncomfortable. My mother said I was pitiful. that I should be grateful I still had my health. She laughed then, a sharp, broken thing. What good is health when your arms are empty? Quinn stood and moved to the hearth. He crouched beside her, not touching, just near enough to feel the heat of him. You are not pitiful, he said. She shook her head. I do not even know why I am here. He looked into her eyes. Because you have nowhere else to go. And that is all right. Silence fell again, but it was different now. Not heavy, just still. She slept that night under the quilt, her body curled inward like something trying to disappear. But when she woke, the air smelled like coffee, and the sun was already up. She sat and found fresh bread on the table, eggs steaming in a pan, and Quinn at the stove, reading something he had written on a scrap of paper. You cook every morning? She asked, voice rough. He glanced over. Only when someone hungry is around to share it. Alethea stayed 3 days. She tried to leave on the 4th. I cannot just stay here, she said, clutching her bundle again. Why not? I am not your problem, Quinn. He stepped closer. You are not a problem. You are a person. Her voice trembled. I do not know how to live with this much hurt. Then let it hurt, he said. You do not have to stop here. But you do not have to leave either. She stared at him. Why are you being kind to me? He looked away for a moment, then back. Because once, someone was kind to me when I did not deserve it. And because you look like you have not been given a reason to stay in a long time. Her throat tightened. Something in her cracked open again, but it hurt less this time. I do not want to be just a shadow in someone else's house, she whispered. You are not, Quinn said. You are light, Alethea. Just buried deep. She stayed. The hens were louder than Alethea expected. They scattered when she opened the coop, wings beating, feathers catching the morning light like flakes of ash. She blinked against the sun, the basket under her arm already warm from the eggs she'd gathered. It was the first chore she'd done in weeks that didn't feel like penance. Quinn leaned against the fence nearby, arms folded, watching the light crawl over the slope behind the cabin. He hadn't said much since breakfast, just handed her the basket and pointed toward the coop with a nod. She hadn't needed more. Her hands had remembered the rhythm on their own. You ever keep birds before? He asked without turning. I helped the cook with them when I was a girl. She let me name them, Alethea said, brushing a bit of straw off her skirt. My favorite was a speckled hen I called Clementine. She used to peck the laces off my boots. Quinn's mouth tugged upward, faint but real. Don't name these. You'll only get attached, and I can't promise they won't end up in the pot come winter. I'm not naming anything anymore, she said, and the words came out flat, without the sting she'd expected. He looked over then. That's fair. The quiet that followed settled easy. Alethea walked the eggs inside, careful not to clatter them in the bowl. The cabin smelled of pine pitch and wood soap. She caught her reflection in the tin basin and paused. Her face looked thinner. Not hollow, not pale, just stripped down, like something honest had been left behind. Later, she found Quinn in the north field, mending a section of fence where the last storm had brought down a post. He didn't look up when she approached, just passed her a second pair of gloves and went back to work. She joined him without speaking, kneeling beside the next post and steadying it while he tamped the earth around it. You always work alone out here? She asked after a while. Mostly. I had a neighbor, Old Man Withers, help me some last fall. He passed in December. Got caught in an early snow bringing in his stock. I'm sorry. He drove the tamping rod into the dirt once more, then leaned on it. He was 93. Had more stories than teeth. Went out with his boots on, just like he wanted. She smiled, brief and small. Sounds like the kind of man who'd be hard to forget. Quinn wiped his brow with his sleeve. He used to say the land don't care if you're grieving, but it'll let you grieve while you work. I think he was right. Alethea looked out over the hills, the curve of the grasslands dipping into timber. There's something honest about it. The work. He nodded. This place don't ask for much. Just your time. Your hands. And maybe your heart, eventually. Quinn studied her then, not with pity or caution, but with something steadier. If it asks, it's because it knows you've got one worth offering. She didn't answer. Didn't need to. The moment folded into the sound of wind moving through the cottonwoods, the scrape of grit against wood, the steady breath of two people who hadn't yet said what was quietly building between them. That evening, she sat on the porch with a tin cup of water, her sleeves rolled, her feet bare. The sun dipped low, and the sky turned the color of apricots. Quinn stepped out, rolling a shoulder as he settled beside her. Mail comes in on Friday, he said, glancing toward the road. If you're wanting to write anyone. She shook her head. There's no one left who'd want a letter from me. He didn't press. Just sat beside her, their silence turning companionable. Eventually she asked, "What brought you here?" He took a long breath. An uncle gave me the land when I was 20. Told me I could do better than the war. I didn't know what that meant then. I was just tired of blood and orders that didn't make sense. You were a soldier? Cavalry. Missouri, mostly. He looked out across the field. Spent a year chasing ghosts after I got out. Thought maybe if I kept moving, I wouldn't have to carry what I saw. Turns out, you carry it either way. Might as well do it somewhere with clean air and good soil. She reached down and pulled a burr from the hem of her dress. And now you just stay. I build fences. Cut wood. Cook when I remember. And every now and then, someone like you shows up and reminds me that silence isn't the same as peace. Her throat tightened, but she swallowed it back. You're not what I expected. Good or bad. Just different. Like you've made a home out of things other people would have run from. He looked at her then, not with surprise, but with something deeper. Maybe that's the only way we get a home. By staying when it'd be easier to go. She didn't look away. I think I'd like to try. He didn't move toward her. Didn't speak. But the air between them shifted, warm and certain. Not a promise. Not yet. Just the beginning of one. The first frost came early that year. Alethea woke to the windows laced with ice and the scent of wood smoke thick in the air. She pulled her shawl tighter as she stepped outside, boots crunching over the stiff ground. Across the yard, Quinn was already splitting kindling, his breath rising in short, visible bursts. She crossed the yard without calling out, watching the easy way he moved measured, unhurried, like he understood the rhythm of the cold and had no need to rush it. He looked up when she drew near, lowering the axe. Didn't expect it this soon, she said, rubbing her arms. Neither did the stock. Had to break ice off the trough this morning. He pulled a glove from his hand and reached into his coat pocket. Found these in the shed. Thought they might fit. She took the wool mittens, rough spun, and clearly mended more than once. The left cuff was stitched in red thread, a small, careful patch. Who made them? She asked, slipping them over her fingers. My aunt. She used to send things like that before she passed. Claimed I'd catch my death if I didn't learn to dress properly. Alethea smiled faintly. She sounds sensible. She was. And loud about it. He stacked the last of the wood and straightened. I was thinking if you're staying through winter, we should make a trip into town soon. You'll need better boots. Maybe a coat that closes right. She hesitated. I've no money to speak of. I didn't ask for any, Quinn said gently. We'll trade for what we can. I've got a few pelts I've been saving. She looked down at her hands, thumbs brushing over the red thread. I'll earn it. You already are. They didn't speak much after that, but something passed between them, a quiet understanding, solid as the frost under their feet. Later that day, they hitched the wagon and headed toward town. The road was rutted and narrow, winding between stands of birch and tamarack. Alethea sat with her hands tucked beneath her thighs, the wind biting through the seams of her dress. Quinn kept one hand on the reins, the other resting lightly on his thigh, his hat pulled low against the glare. "Do you miss it?" she asked after a stretch of silence. "Miss what?" "The moving. The drifting." His jaw worked once. "Sometimes. But not the rest of it. I got tired of sleeping under trees and not remembering what town I was near. This land gave me a reason to stop. And now—" Quinn glanced at her. "Now I've got more than one." She didn't answer right away. The wagon creaked as it dipped into a shallow rut. Then she said, "I never learned how to be still. Even when I had a home, I was always bracing for something to shift. That's no way to live." "It was the only way I knew." He nodded once, not speaking again until the rooftops of town came into view. They traded beaver pelts and a worn saddle blanket to the general store for boots thick with lining and a wool coat that smelled faintly of cedar. Alethea touched the hem of the coat as they stepped outside, the fabric heavier than anything she'd worn since Helena. "It's too much," she murmured. Quinn stepped down from the boardwalk and offered his hand.
"No."
"It's just enough." On the way home, they passed a fallen cottonwood, its trunk hollowed by rot. Alethea pointed to it as they rode past. "My boys used to turn stumps like that into castles," she said, her voice even. "They'd fill the holes with twigs and stones and tell each other stories about kings and monsters." Quinn didn't speak, but he slowed the wagon, letting the horses pick their way carefully over the frozen ground. "I used to think if I could just keep them believing in those stories, the world wouldn't touch them for a while longer." "It's a good thing to give a child," he said. "A world that's softer than the one they'll grow into." Her hands curled into the coat sleeves. "I don't know if I can be that kind of person again." "You don't have to be," he said. "Not all at once." They reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Alethea carried the supplies inside, while Quinn unharnessed the team. She set the new boots beside the hearth, their leather catching the firelight, and sat on the edge of the cot, untying her bonnet. When Quinn came in, he paused in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders. "You all right?" he asked. She looked up at him, her eyes clear.
"Yes."
"I think I am." He crossed the room and stood in front of her, his hands loose at his sides. "I've been thinking about putting in a root cellar," he said. "Come spring. Could use your help planning it." "I'd like that." He nodded once, and something in his expression shifted, not dramatic, not sudden, just sure. He reached out, slow and steady, and brushed a bit of hay from her sleeve. His hand lingered a moment longer than needed. They stood that way for a while.
"No declarations. No rush."
Just the quiet closeness of two people who had learned to stay. By the second week of frost, Alethea began rising before the sun. The habit came without thought, waking while the cabin was still shadowed, pulling on her wool coat with fingers stiff from cold, and stepping outside to the scent of newly split pine. Quinn had given up pretending not to notice. "You walk a line out there each morning," he said one day, his voice low as he poured hot water into the basin. She peeled her gloves off, steam rising from her skin. "I don't understand. You move like you're tracing something. Same path. Same turns." "I suppose I am," she said. "It's the shape of a cradle. I walked it when they were cutting teeth." Quinn didn't look up, but his hand stilled on the tin cup. Then he set it down and said nothing more. That night, the wind howled off the ridgeline. The shutters rattled, and the fire threw long, flickering light across the cabin walls. Alethea sat near the hearth, sewing a new cuff onto one of Quinn's flannel shirts. The fabric was worn through at the elbow, and her stitches weren't neat, but they held. "You always mend by firelight?" Quinn asked, crouching beside the stove to stoke the flames. "I used to do it by lamplight, but the fire feels steadier." He nodded toward the shirt. "You don't have to do that." "I know." She didn't look up, but she felt him watching her. Not like he was studying her, more like he was learning something he didn't want to interrupt. "I've been meaning to ask," he said after a pause. "What did you want before all of it? Before Helena? Before the boys?" She set the needle aside and leaned back in the chair, eyes distant. "I wanted to teach. Not arithmetic or recitation. I wanted to teach reading. I used to think if I could put a book in a child's hand, I could give them a way out. Or, at least a way through." "You could still do that," he said, voice quiet. "I'm not sure who would take me now." Quinn's brow furrowed slightly. "You're not marked, Alethea. Grief isn't a stain." She met his gaze fully then. "You're the only person who's ever said that to me." He didn't answer, but something in his face changed to stillness that spoke more than words. The next morning, Quinn hitched the wagon earlier than usual. He loaded 2 sacks of oats, a rifle wrapped in oilcloth, and a coil of rope. "I'll be riding out to help the Anders family move their cattle before the snow gets too deep," he said. "Won't be back before dark." Alethea stepped down from the porch, brushing hay from her skirt. "You want me to keep the fire going?" He adjusted the cinch on the team. "That and mind the chickens. They've been slipping under the fence near the north field." "I'll fix the gap," she said. He paused, then added, "If you have time, there's a book in the chest under the window. It's the only one with pages still attached to the spine." She raised an eyebrow. "And you're just now mentioning it?" "I thought you'd find it when you were ready." He climbed up onto the wagon and tipped his hat. She watched him go until the sound of wheels faded into the hush of winter brush. Inside, the chest creaked when she opened it. The book lay beneath folded linens, a leather-bound volume with cracked corners and gold lettering dulled by time. She thumbed through the first few pages, the smell of dust and ink rising like breath. By the time Quinn returned, the fire was high, the chickens penned, and the coat he'd left by the door had been stitched where the lining had given way. He stepped inside, shaking snow from his shoulders. "You find it?" She held up the book. "I did. And I read the first 5 chapters." He smiled, slow and genuine. "What did you think?" "I think you've been hiding it out of pride, not preservation." Most of the pages were dog-eared. He didn't deny it. Before bed, she folded the coat and laid it across the chair. He watched her, then said, "There's a small schoolhouse 2 valleys over. The woman who ran it married and moved to Butte last spring. It's been shut since." She turned toward him. "You think they'd let me take it on?" "I think you'd be the first to care enough to try." The lamp flickered as she reached out and lit the wick higher. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for that." "You don't have to be," he said. "You just have to want the work." A beat passed between them. Then she said, "I do." He moved toward her slowly, the space between them narrowing with each step. When he reached her, he didn't touch her. He didn't have to. "You're not just passing through anymore, are you?" he asked.
"No," she said.
"I think I've stayed." The thaw came slow. By late March, the snow had receded in patches, revealing black earth and the broken stalks of last year's grass. Streams ran high with meltwater, and the cottonwoods near the creek had begun to bud, their branches tipped with the faintest green. Alethea stood barefoot on the porch, hem lifted just enough to keep out the wet, as she listened to the sound of the thawing world. Quinn was inside, oiling the hinges of the schoolhouse desk he'd hauled back from a neighboring ranch. She could hear the quiet scrape of cloth on metal, the occasional creak of wood adjusting to the warmth. He'd said nothing when she'd asked for it, just disappeared one morning and returned with the desk balanced across the wagon bed, his hands scraped raw from the lifting. She stepped back in, drying her feet on the rag rug before crossing to where he worked. The desk was simple, pine and iron, with initials carved into the underside, proof of someone's long-ago boredom. "Still think they'll let me teach?" she asked, crouching beside him. He turned the cloth slowly, working it into the hinge. "I spoke to a man at the post last week. He said the families out there have been asking if anyone plans to reopen it. I told him you were considering. You told them that? I did. She leaned her elbows on her knees. What if I fail them? You won't, he said. You've lived too much not to offer something real. Her voice went quiet. I want to do something that matters. He set the cloth down. You already do. Later that afternoon, they rode out to the old schoolhouse. It stood a mile east of the cabin, near a stand of alder trees. The roof sagged along one edge, and mice had made a home in the corners, but the floor held, and the windows still caught the light. Alethea walked the room slowly, touching the chalk shelf, the scarred teacher's table, the cast-iron stove in the back wall. There's a kind of silence here that isn't empty, she said. Quinn leaned in the doorway. That's because it's waiting. They spent the next weeks repairing the roof, clearing the brush, and rechinking the gaps in the wall. Quinn split wood for the stove while Alethea scrubbed every board until her hands blistered. Word spread without effort. One afternoon, a woman with a broad face and a crying child in her shawl came to the door with a sack of cornmeal and her thanks. By mid-April, 7 children had come to the school. Alethea wrote their names in a ledger she kept beneath the desk. She taught them letters, then words, then phrases pulled from the dog-eared book Quinn had given her. She read to them in the afternoons, her voice steady, even when the wind howled down from the hills. At night, she and Quinn returned to the cabin. They shared meals, mended what needed mending, and spoke in the kind of quiet that had become familiar. It was not the silence of grief anymore. It was the silence of comfort. One evening, as she washed her hands in the basin, he stepped behind her and reached for a towel. You've made something real out there, he said, drying her fingers. She looked up at him, their reflections soft in the glass. So have you. He held her hand a moment longer than needed, then folded it gently in his. I never let myself think I'd have a home like this, he said. Not with someone who sees me and stays. I didn't stay out of obligation, Quinn. I know. She turned to face him fully. I stayed because you gave me space to remember who I was to become someone new, without shame. His eyes didn't leave hers. I want to build more than walls with you. She reached up, fingers tracing the edge of his jaw, rough with a day's work. Then come here and start. He kissed her like he'd been waiting his whole life to do it right. There was no rush, no fire. Just warmth and weight and the slow, certain joining of 2 people who had lived through enough to know what mattered now. That spring, Quinn built a second room onto the cabin. He said it was for space, but they both knew it was because the cot had stayed empty since the night they'd chosen each other fully. They planted a garden behind the cabin: potatoes, beans, and squash. Alethea learned to shoot well enough to scare off the fox that circled the chicken coop. Quinn began carving wooden letters in the evenings, one for each child in her class. By summer, the schoolhouse had 18 students. The town's pastor stopped by with a letter from the territorial board recognizing her as an official teacher. She hung it by the door, beside a drawing one of the girls had made of her reading beneath a tree. On the second Sunday of June, they married in the clearing behind the school. The children brought wildflowers. Quinn wore his best shirt, and Alethea tucked a sprig of sage into her braid. The vows were simple, promises made without flourish, spoken steady and low, like everything else they'd built. Afterward, they walked home together, hands clasped, the sun warm on their backs. No one spoke of the past that day. Not the children she'd lost, not the war Quinn had survived, not the loneliness they'd both known. There was only the sound of wind in the grass and the sure step of 2 people who had found not just shelter, but a life. They never left the valley. The school grew, and so did the garden. They built a bench beneath the cottonwood where she used to walk her morning path. In the evenings, they sat there with hands entwined, listening to the creek roll by and the world settle into peace. And each morning, when the first light touched the porch, Quinn woke to the sound of Alethea's laughter, quiet, sure, and full of the life they had made from sorrow and seed.